Another story awaits, but first, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Some crimes are solved by detectives, some are solved by witnesses, and then there are the rarest cases of all, where the victim becomes the key to their own justice. This is one of those stories, a case where answers did not come from a confession or a lucky break, but from something the victim left behind, knowing, perhaps, that the truth would one day need a voice. When police first responded to the scene, there was no reason to believe this case would become anything extraordinary. It looked, at first glance, like another tragic death with limited leads and more questions than answers. The victim was gone, the suspect was not obvious, and the silence surrounding the crime felt heavy. But buried within that silence was a clue that would change everything. The case centered on a woman whose life ended under suspicious circumstances. There were no clear signs of a forced entry, no eyewitnesses stepping forward, no immediate suspect standing out. For investigators, this was the most difficult kind of case, one where nothing seemed out of place, yet something was clearly wrong. Law enforcement began with routine procedures. The area was secured. Evidence was collected, neighbors were interviewed, friends and family were notified. Everyone asked the same question: what happened? And just as importantly, who was responsible? At the center of the investigation was David Anthony, a man connected to the victim in a personal way. At the time, there was nothing solid tying him directly to a crime. Like many cases involving close relationships, emotions were complicated, timelines were unclear, and stories did not always match up. Investigators had to move carefully, guided by facts rather than assumptions. Early interviews produced little. People close to the victim described her as cautious, thoughtful, and aware of her surroundings. She was not known to take risks. That detail mattered. It suggested that if something felt wrong to her, she would not ignore it, and that insight would later prove critical. The medical examination raised concerns. While the cause of death was initially unclear, there were signs that this was not a natural passing. Still, without a clear mechanism or obvious suspect, the case risked stalling. These are the moments when many investigations slow down, sometimes permanently. But as detectives continued reviewing the victim's personal belongings, they noticed something unusual. It was small, easy to miss, something that didn't look like evidence at first, yet the more they looked at it, the more it stood out. It was not random, it was intentional. The victim had left behind information, details that seemed to document fear, awareness, and preparation. This was not a coincidence. It suggested she believed something bad might happen to her, and instead of staying silent, she made a decision. If anything happened, she wanted the truth to survive her. For investigators, this discovery changed the direction of the case. It was no longer just about reconstructing the final hours. It was about understanding what the victim knew before her death, and why she felt the need to record it. Police began carefully examining this information. They checked timelines, compared statements, verified movements. Slowly, inconsistencies started to appear, small ones at first. A time that didn't line up, a detail that conflicted with physical evidence. Each one, on its own, seemed minor. Together, they formed a pattern. David Anthony's statements were reviewed again, this time through a different lens. Investigators were no longer asking only what happened after the crime. They were asking what the victim had been experiencing before it. And in that shift, the truth began to surface. This was not a case solved quickly. It required patience, restraint, and respect for the facts. Detectives resisted pressure to rush to conclusions. Instead, they let the evidence speak, especially the evidence the victim herself had provided. As the investigation continued, police realized something remarkable. The victim had anticipated disbelief. She had anticipated denial, and she had prepared for it. Her actions were deliberate, calculated, and meant to outlast her. In a way, she had become a silent witness, one who could no longer speak, but whose message was impossible to ignore. Cases like this force investigators to confront a difficult reality. Victims are not always powerless. Sometimes, in the face of fear, they act with clarity and courage. They leave behind pieces of the truth, hoping someone will care enough to put them together. For law enforcement, that responsibility is heavy. It means listening closely, not just to the living, but to the dead. It means recognizing that evidence is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it whispers. As more details emerged, the focus on David Anthony intensified. The relationship dynamics were examined. The timeline tightened. What once looked like coincidence began to look like control. What once looked like confusion began to look like intent. Still, nothing would move forward without proof. Suspicion alone is not justice. Investigators knew that if this case was going to stand, it had to be built on facts strong enough to speak for a victim who no longer could. And that is where the true weight of this story lies. Not in shock or spectacle, but in the quiet determination of a woman who refused to let her truth die with her. As investigators looked deeper into what the victim had left behind, they began to understand that this was not a random collection of thoughts or notes. It was structured, purposeful, almost like a roadmap. Whatever fear she had been living with, it was serious enough for her to take steps to preserve the truth. The material pointed toward a growing sense of unease in her daily life. She had noticed changes in behavior from someone she trusted, conversations that felt off, moments that made her question intentions. She didn't act out of panic, she acted out of awareness. That distinction mattered to detectives. It showed clear thinking, not confusion. Police began placing these details alongside known facts. Phone records were reviewed, text messages were examined line by line, times and dates were cross-checked. Slowly, the pieces started aligning. What the victim had recorded matched real-world data in ways that could not be ignored. At this stage, David Anthony was still not formally charged. He remained a person of interest, but investigators were careful. They knew that cases involving close relationships are often clouded by emotion, and emotion can lead to mistakes. The goal was clarity, not speed. As detectives interviewed people close to the victim, a clearer picture emerged of her final months. Friends recalled subtle changes. She had become more guarded, more observant. Some remembered her saying she felt watched, or that she no longer felt safe in situations that once felt normal. At the time, no one imagined these comments would later become critical. One friend recalled a conversation where the victim spoke about trusting her instincts. She said that if anything ever happened to her, people should look closely at those around her. It was not said dramatically. It was said calmly. That calmness stayed with investigators. The victim's routine was also examined: where she went, who she saw, what changed near the end. Detectives noticed patterns that aligned closely with the concerns she had documented. Her movements became more limited, her communications more selective. It was as if she was quietly protecting herself, while also preparing for the worst. Meanwhile, David Anthony's timeline began to show cracks. On the surface, his story sounded reasonable, but when matched against physical evidence and digital data, inconsistencies appeared. Not enough to accuse, but enough to question. Investigators brought him in again, this time asking more precise questions. Details he had once brushed past were now examined closely. Times, locations, sequences of events. Each answer was measured against what the victim had left behind. It became clear that the victim had not only been documenting fear, she had been documenting behavior, actions that felt controlling, moments that felt threatening, situations that made her believe she was in danger. These were not accusations, they were observations, and that made them powerful. For detectives, this was a rare situation. Normally, investigators work backward from a crime scene. Here they were also working forward, from the victim's perspective, trying to understand how she experienced the lead-up to her own death. This approach changed everything. It revealed motive, it explained tension, it gave context to actions that once seemed ordinary. The victim had seen something others had not, and she had quietly recorded it. As the pressure increased, David Anthony's behavior shifted. Interviews became more defensive, answers became shorter. He corrected himself more often. Investigators are trained to notice these changes, not as proof, but as indicators. Something was weighing on him. Still, the case needed something solid, something undeniable. That came when detectives compared the victim's documentation with a specific event she had flagged as critical. When checked against digital records, that event lined up exactly. Timestamps matched, locations confirmed. The victim had been telling the truth. That moment marked a turning point. What once felt like suspicion now had support. What once felt like a theory now had evidence. The victim was no longer just a tragic figure. She was an active participant in solving her own case. Detectives began preparing for the next phase. This meant tightening the investigation, gathering corroboration, and ensuring that every step was legally sound. If charges were going to be filed, they had to be unbreakable. Throughout this process, investigators kept returning to one thought: the victim knew. She knew she might not be believed right away. She knew the truth might be questioned, and still she left it behind. Cases like this leave a lasting impact on those who work them. They challenge assumptions about power, silence, and justice. They remind investigators that victims are not just evidence, they are voices, even after death. By the end of this phase of the investigation, police were no longer asking if the victim's information mattered. They were asking how much of the case depended on it, and the answer was becoming clear. As the investigation moved forward, detectives shifted their focus from gathering background information to building a case that could stand in court. At this stage, everything depended on connecting the victim's documented concerns to clear, provable actions. Suspicion alone was not enough. What they needed was a solid chain of facts. They began by reconstructing the days leading up to the victim's death in exact detail, hour by hour, call by call, message by message. Every digital footprint was examined carefully. The victim's phone records showed a pattern of communication that became increasingly tense over time. Messages that once sounded normal slowly took on a different tone. Short replies, delays, avoidance. These changes matched what she had written about feeling pressured and uncomfortable. Investigators also reviewed location data. This was critical. The victim had noted specific moments when she felt someone was tracking her movements. When police compared her notes with GPS data from phones and vehicles, the overlap was disturbing. The same locations appeared again and again, not by accident, not by coincidence. David Anthony's movements were placed alongside hers. At first, he claimed his presence near those locations was random or work-related, but randomness falls apart under repetition. When the same overlaps appeared on multiple days, detectives knew they were looking at a pattern. At this point, police brought in digital forensic experts. Deleted messages were recovered, hidden files were uncovered. What stood out was not just what was said, but what had been erased. Gaps in conversations raised red flags. The victim, on the other hand, had preserved information instead of hiding it. That contrast spoke volumes. One key discovery came from a time-stamped note the victim had saved shortly before her death. It referenced a confrontation, one that had not been reported to anyone at the time. She wrote about fear, confusion, and a sense that things were spiraling out of control. She didn't dramatize it. She simply recorded what happened, as if she wanted the facts to speak for themselves. When detectives compared this note with surveillance footage from nearby areas, they found confirmation. Vehicles, movements, timing. The victim's account matched what cameras quietly captured. This was no longer just her word, it was reality, recorded from multiple angles. As the case tightened, David Anthony was interviewed again. This time, the questions were direct. Investigators didn't accuse, they confronted him with facts. His reactions changed. He grew frustrated, defensive. He began explaining details that hadn't been asked about, a common sign of stress. Small contradictions appeared. He changed the order of events. He struggled to explain certain time gaps. When pressed, his answers became vague. Investigators noted everything. They knew that truth remains consistent, while false stories shift under pressure. Meanwhile, the victim's voice continued to guide the investigation. She had anticipated doubt. She had anticipated denial. That's why she documented not just what happened, but how it made her feel. Her emotional state added context that numbers alone could not provide. Fear has a pattern, and hers was clear. Police also spoke with professionals who had interacted with the victim shortly before her death. Subtle comments she made were now seen in a new light. She had hinted at danger. She had expressed concern about being alone. At the time, these statements seemed like general stress. Now, they sounded like warnings. As evidence stacked up, detectives prepared to move toward charges. But before that could happen, they needed motive. Why would someone do this? The victim's notes again played a key role. They revealed a growing tension rooted in control, rejection, and the fear of losing influence. This wasn't about a single moment, it was about escalation. Experts reviewed the psychological elements of the case. They explained how patterns of control often intensify when someone senses they are losing power. The victim's increasing independence may have triggered something dangerous. Her awareness of this shift may have saved the truth, even if it couldn't save her life. The final step before arrest was a careful review by prosecutors. Every detail was examined, every claim tested. The victim's documentation, once private and quiet, now became central evidence. It transformed her from a victim into a witness. When the decision was finally made, it wasn't rushed, it was deliberate. Investigators knew the weight of what they were about to do. They also knew that the victim had done her part. She had left behind clarity in a moment of fear. She had trusted that someone would listen, and now they were. The arrest did not happen in a dramatic rush. It came after weeks of quiet preparation, careful coordination, and long conversations between investigators and prosecutors. By this point, the case had shifted from uncertainty to inevitability. The question was no longer what happened, but how the truth would be presented and proven. When David Anthony was taken into custody, he appeared calm on the surface. There was no public outburst, no immediate denial shouted for others to hear, but those who had followed the investigation closely could see the tension underneath. He knew this moment was coming. The pressure had been building for too long. During the first post-arrest interview, detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece. They didn't overwhelm him. They guided him. Phone records, location data, witness statements, surveillance footage, and finally, the victim's own words. Each item narrowed the space he had to move. At first, he attempted to explain away the evidence. He suggested misunderstandings. He claimed coincidences, but coincidences do not repeat with such precision. As the interview continued, his explanations grew thinner. Long pauses filled the room. His breathing changed. He asked for clarification more often, even when questions were simple. What struck investigators most was his reaction to the victim's documentation. When her words were read aloud, the room shifted. This was no longer about technology or timelines. It was about intent, her fear, her awareness, her decision to preserve the truth. For the first time, David Anthony seemed unsettled. From that point on, the interview took a different direction. Detectives weren't just asking what happened, they were asking why. Why had tensions escalated? Why had control become an issue? Why had the victim felt unsafe enough to prepare for her own death? He offered partial answers. He minimized conflict. He framed himself as misunderstood, but the victim's notes contradicted him in quiet, powerful ways. She had described patterns that matched his behavior exactly. This wasn't hindsight, it was foresight. As the case moved toward trial, the focus turned to presenting the victim's voice in a courtroom that would never hear it directly. Prosecutors worked carefully, ensuring that her documentation was introduced legally and respectfully. This was not about shock, it was about truth. The defense attempted to cast doubt on her state of mind. They suggested fear could distort perception, but experts explained that her documentation showed consistency, clarity, and awareness. She had not been confused, she had been cautious, and caution, in this case, became evidence. Witnesses took the stand. Friends spoke about changes they noticed. Professionals described warning signs. Digital experts explained how data aligned with her records. One by one, the narrative came together. It wasn't loud, it was steady. Throughout the trial, David Anthony maintained his innocence. But innocence is not declared, it is demonstrated. And with each day, the gap between his version of events and the facts grew wider. The jury listened carefully. They heard the victim's words not as emotional pleas, but as documented observations. They saw how her awareness turned into a timeline that investigators could follow. They understood that she hadn't just been afraid, she had been right. This realization carried weight. It changed how the case was viewed. The victim was no longer seen as someone caught off guard. She was someone who recognized danger and acted, even when the cost was unimaginable. As closing arguments approached, prosecutors made one thing clear: this was not a case solved by chance. It was solved because the victim refused to disappear without leaving the truth behind. The courtroom fell silent as the jury prepared to deliberate. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, a decision waited, one that would determine how history remembered both the victim and the man accused of taking her life. The verdict did not come quickly. The jury spent long hours reviewing evidence, replaying testimony, and returning again and again to the victim's words. Those notes, messages, and records followed them into deliberation like a quiet presence in the room. They were not emotional appeals, they were facts, and facts are difficult to ignore. When the jury returned, the courtroom was still. The verdict was read clearly. Guilty. The words landed with weight, not celebration. There was no sense of victory, only a recognition that a life had been taken and that truth had finally been acknowledged. For the victim's loved ones, the moment was complex, relief mixed with grief. Justice, when it comes after loss, never feels complete. But there was comfort in knowing that her voice had been heard. She had not been erased. She had spoken through the evidence she left behind. During sentencing, the court revisited the full scope of the crime. The judge spoke about responsibility, intent, and the impact on the community. Particular attention was given to the victim's foresight. The court acknowledged that this case stood apart because the victim had actively contributed to uncovering the truth. That reality shaped how the crime was understood. David Anthony addressed the court briefly. His words were measured, but they did little to change the outcome. Accountability had already been established. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime and the lasting harm caused. As the sentence was handed down, the courtroom remained quiet. There were no cheers, only deep breaths and bowed heads. Justice, in this case, was not loud. It was final. Outside the courtroom, the case drew public attention. People were struck by one question above all others. How did the victim know? Experts explained that awareness often comes from patterns, small signs that build over time. The victim had trusted those signs when others might have dismissed them. Law enforcement agencies began referencing the case in training discussions. It became an example of how victim documentation can play a critical role in investigations. Officers emphasized listening closely, even when fear is expressed quietly. For the victim's family, the trial did not bring closure, but it brought clarity. They spoke about her strength, her intelligence, and her courage. They described her not as a statistic, but as a person who refused to let fear silence her. The case also sparked conversations about personal safety and awareness. People talked about trusting instincts, documenting concerns, and reaching out for help. While no one should have to prepare for such an outcome, the victim's actions saved the truth. In the end, this was not just a case about a crime. It was about foresight, about a woman who understood danger and chose to leave a record. Her decision transformed the investigation and ensured that justice did not depend on chance. Her life was taken, but her voice remained. And through that voice, the truth found its way forward. Even after the courtroom emptied and the case files were closed, the story did not truly end. Some cases leave behind paperwork, others leave behind questions. This one left behind a lesson that stayed with everyone who touched it. For investigators, this case became a reminder of why listening matters, not just listening to loud cries for help, but to quiet signals, to small changes, to words written in private moments of fear. The victim was never dramatic. She never asked for attention. She simply observed, recorded, and trusted that truth would matter one day. In the months that followed the trial, law enforcement agencies quietly studied the case. Training sessions referenced it. Detectives discussed how rare it is for a victim to document danger so clearly before a crime occurs. But rare does not mean impossible. This case proved that awareness can outlive violence. The victim's family continued forward, carrying both grief and pride. They spoke about her intelligence, her calm strength, and her ability to sense when something was wrong. They said she always believed in facts, in clarity, in being prepared. In a way, that belief became her final act of protection, not for herself, but for the truth. Public reaction to the case was strong. People didn't just talk about the crime, they talked about instincts, about moments they had ignored in their own lives, about the difference between fear and intuition. Many said the case changed how they think about safety, trust, and silence. What made this story different was not just how it ended, but how it was guided. The investigation did not stumble onto the truth by luck. It followed a trail that had been carefully, quietly left behind. The victim had understood something critical. Danger does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it announces itself slowly. David Anthony will spend the rest of his life known not for the control he sought, but for the truth he could not escape. No matter how carefully a lie is constructed, it cannot survive against consistent facts. And those facts were waiting long before the police arrived. This case stands as proof that victims are not powerless, even when they are silenced. Their awareness, their preparation, and their courage can carry forward when they cannot. Justice in this case was not delayed by chance. It was guided by intention. In the end, the victim did something extraordinary. She turned fear into evidence. She turned awareness into a voice. And she ensured that the story of her life would not be rewritten by the person who tried to erase it. Some crimes are solved by detectives. This one was solved by the victim herself. And that truth will never fade.